Okay, so you know how it is these days, right? You're trying to stay informed about the really complicated, important stuff, global issues, all that. But it's tough to really get a grasp on things with so much noise out there.
Absolutely. It's really hard to sort through everything and figure out what really matters.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to understand not just the surface level, but, the real in-depth details.
The underlying forces that are shaping
Right,
events.
precisely. And that's what we try to do here on the deep dive. Deep dive deep into the critical issues, give you that shortcut to being well informed.
To cut through all that noise.
Exactly. So today we're going to be looking at some pretty major shifts in the global military landscape.
And it's crucial to see how these developments connect. They're not happening in isolation.
Absolutely. They're all intertwined in a lot of ways. So to be specific, we're going to be zeroing in on China's expanding military power.
Which has been making headlines recently.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to be focusing on the Pentagon's latest report on their capabilities and particularly the implications of their rapidly expanding missile forces, including their nuclear arsenal.
A topic that always grabs attention.
Oh, for sure. It's a lot to process, but we've gone through it all, pulled out the really key insights for you.
To give you a framework for understanding all of this, we've actually synthesized information from 3 main sources.
Okay, so kind of like a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, exactly. So the first source is the newest Pentagon report on China's military strength. It's a really in-depth assessment.
Okay, straight from the source.
Right. And then we have an article that really focuses on the U.S. response to this, particularly something called the Iron Dome for America initiative.
Interesting. Okay, I'm not familiar with that yet.
We'll definitely unpack that. And the third source is an analysis of China's nuclear weapons program from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists.
Okay, so a more independent expert perspective.
Precisely giving you a well-rounded view of the situation.
So you're getting a multifaceted picture here. An official evaluation of China's military, an examination how the U.S. is reacting, and an independent expert breakdown of a vital part of their overall strength.
To put it all together for you.
Right, because honestly, there's just so much information out there.
It can be really overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. And our aim here is to distill this down to what you really need to know, pull out the most critical information from these sources, connect the dots so it makes sense, and highlight those aha moments, those key takeaways that give you a clear and concise understanding of what's happening and why it matters.
Without getting bogged down in too much detail.
Right, because who has time for that? Okay, let's jump into this, starting with the U.S. response.
So let's dive into this Iron Dome for America initiative. And I think what's really fascinating here is the underlying recognition by the U.S.
Okay, in what way?
Well, they're acknowledging a potential vulnerability, a shift in the balance of power, in a sense.
Because of China's military advancements.
In part, yeah. But it's actually broader than that. They're recognizing a vulnerability to these newer, more advanced missile technologies coming not just from China, but from other potential adversaries like Russia, too.
Okay, so it's not just about China specifically.
Right. It's about a new kind of threat, these advanced missiles that are much harder to defend against than what they've dealt with before.
So this isn't just about, upgrading existing defenses. It's a push for a completely new kind of system.
Exactly. A multi-layered system that can handle these emerging threats.
And it sounds like the driving force behind this urgency is these advancements we're seeing in hypersonic missile technology.
Yes, that's a key factor. These hypersonic weapons are incredibly fast, and they can maneuver in ways that make them really difficult for current missile defense systems to intercept.
So like trying to hit a moving target that's moving at, 5 times the speed of sound.
Something like that. Yeah, they pose unique challenges both in terms of detecting them and actually intercepting them.
Right, because they're not following predictable trajectories like traditional ballistic missiles.
Exactly. And as our sources point out, the U.S. government really views these as game changers.
I mean, it makes sense. They have the potential to really upset the existing balance of power.
Absolutely. And the U.S. is now recognizing that vulnerability, which is forcing them into this rapid and potentially very costly technological arms race in missile defense.
So a major shift in priorities then.
Definitely. It shows that they're taking this threat seriously.
So who are the main players in building this Iron Dome? I imagine the big defense contractors are involved.
Oh, absolutely. You've got the usual suspects here. Major companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and L3 Harris, all positioning themselves to play a role.
I mean, they're the ones with the expertise in these kind of cutting-edge technologies.
Right. And they're already working on various aspects of this. Northrop Grumman, for example, already has contracts for detecting missiles from space, and they're actively developing ways to intercept hypersonic missiles.
Okay, so space-based sensors and interceptors.
That's the direction this is heading in.
That sounds incredibly advanced, but also potentially controversial.
Right, and the article we looked at pointed that out pretty clearly.
Because putting weapons in space changes the game completely.
It does, and there are a lot of concerns about that, particularly among arms control organizations and even potentially within Congress.
Because it could be seen as a really escalatory move.
Exactly. Other countries might interpret it as the U.S. trying to gain a decisive military advantage.
Which could lead to a whole other set of problems.
Right, like an arms race in space, increased tensions, and a higher risk of miscalculation or even unintended conflict.
And the fact that you need extremely fast reaction times to deal with hypersonic threats just adds to those worries.
That's a key point because it reduces the time for decision-making, which increases the risk of mistakes or overreactions.
Okay, so the stakes are incredibly high with this technology. But let's talk about the capabilities themselves. What are these companies actually bringing to the table to address these threats?
So, for example, Lockheed Martin's CEO has been emphasizing the critical role of artificial intelligence and really fast data transmission in countering these advanced missiles.
Okay, because you need to be able to make decisions and react extremely quickly.
Exactly. Humans can't keep up with the speeds involved, so you need AI to help process information and make those split-second decisions.
And Lockheed Martin is already working on a next-generation interceptor for traditional ballistic missiles, right?
That's right, and they could potentially leverage that expertise for hypersonic defense as well.
And what about L3 Harris? What are they focusing on?
Well, they're really heavily involved in creating tracking satellites for the Space Development Agency's Tracking Layer program.
Okay, so this program is specifically designed to deal with hypersonic threats.
Yes, the idea is to have a network of satellites in low Earth orbit that can detect and track these missiles from space.
So it's a layered approach.
Yeah.
You have satellites for early warning and tracking, and then they feed that data to ground-based or potentially space-based interceptors.
Precisely so. It's a really complex system with a lot of moving parts.
And it sounds like they have a pretty tight deadline to get all of this figured out.
Oh yeah, the Department of Defense has been given just 60 days from the initial announcement to submit a complete plan, a comprehensive architecture for this initiative.
Wow, 60 days. That's not a lot of time to put together something this complex.
It's a really aggressive timeline, and it shows how seriously they're taking this threat. The Missile Defense Agency actually held an industry day recently on February 18th to gather information and assess the technological readiness of various companies.
This is essentially seeing what's out there, what's possible.
Exactly, and they've asked for detailed proposals by the end of February covering everything from capabilities and timelines to cost estimates and the maturity of the technology.
Okay, so the clock is ticking.
Yeah, they're moving quickly on this.
And of course, Congress will ultimately have the final say on the funding for all of this.
Right, and I can only imagine there will be some pretty intense discussions about how this fits into the overall defense budget and the broader priorities.
Because there's always a debate about how much to spend on defense and where to allocate those resources.
Absolutely, and this initiative is going to add fuel to that fire, particularly the idea of space-based interceptors.
Because it's a huge technological undertaking.
Yeah.
And potentially very expensive.
Right, and while some Republicans have voiced initial support for the idea, you can definitely expect a lot more scrutiny and detailed questions when it comes to the specifics of the funding requests.
Especially with the FY 2026 budget process coming up.
Exactly, that's when things will really get interesting.
Okay, so the big question on everyone's mind is, how much is all of this going to cost?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, and to be honest, there isn't a publicly available cost estimate yet for this Iron Dome for America initiative.
Okay, so they're still working out the details.
Yeah, but to give you some context, the Missile Defense Agency already has an annual budget of around $10 billion.
Okay, so we're talking serious money.
Yes, and the Space Development Agency operates with about $4 billion each year.
So this initiative is likely to be a significant addition to those existing budgets.
It's safe to say it will be a major investment.
Okay, so the U.S. is clearly taking these advancements in missile technology very seriously and is moving quickly to develop countermeasures.
No doubt about that.
Now let's switch gears a bit and dig into the Pentagon report itself, see what it reveals about China's military power. This is the 24th report of its kind since 2000. So they've been tracking China's military development for quite some time.
Yeah, for over 2 decades, they've been keeping a close eye on this.
And this latest report really paints a detailed picture of China's ongoing military buildup.
It does, and it's important to consider a couple of seemingly contradictory forces at play here.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, on the one hand, the report acknowledges the persistent issue of corruption within the Chinese military structure and certain organizational weaknesses that come with such a large and rapidly growing force.
So internal challenges that could hinder their effectiveness.
Right. But on the other hand, you have the undeniable ability of the Chinese Communist Party to mobilize vast resources and their massive industrial scale production of highly advanced military systems.
So even with those internal challenges, their capacity to churn out cutting-edge military technology is undeniable.
Exactly. It's a complex picture, a balancing act in a sense.
And the report really emphasizes Xi Jinping's focus on Taiwan and his stated goal for 2027.
Absolutely. Xi Jinping's determination to gain control over Taiwan is a central theme, and the report really highlights his unwavering commitment to achieving what they call the centenary military construction goal by 2027.
Okay, so 2027 is a key date.
It's not just an aspirational target, it's a deadline essentially for having a full range of credible military options available should they decide to take action against Taiwan.
And the report really gets into the details of their nuclear weapons developments, which have been generating a lot of headlines.
Yes, and the numbers are quite significant.
So what's the big takeaway here? What's the aha moment?
I'd say the key insight is that China isn't just incrementally improving its nuclear arsenal, it's making a potentially paradigm-shifting leap in its capabilities.
Meaning they're moving away from a minimal deterrent towards something much more robust.
Precisely. And that has major implications for the strategic balance in the Pacific.
Because it changes the whole calculation in terms of deterrence and potential conflict.
Exactly. It introduces a new level of uncertainty and risk.
So let's get into the specifics. The report states that by early 2024, China had over 600 operational nuclear warheads.
That's correct. A substantial increase from the over 500 that were estimated just the year prior.
And they're not just increasing the number of warheads, but also the range and sophistication of their delivery systems.
Absolutely. The report points out that all of China's roughly 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, are now assessed to have the range to strike the continental United States.
Wow, so they can now hold the entire U.S. mainland at risk.
And the projections for the future are even more striking.
In what way?
Well, the Pentagon anticipates that China will likely have over 1,000 operational warheads by the year 2030, with the majority of those having the range to hit the U.S.
Okay, so a significant increase in both quantity and capability.
And by 2035, that number could potentially grow to around 1,500.
So a steady and quite rapid expansion of their nuclear arsenal.
And it's not just about the numbers, they're also developing more advanced ways to deliver these weapons, including things like strategic hypersonic glide vehicles.
I've heard of those, but remind me what makes them so special.
Well, think of them as highly maneuverable warheads that travel at incredibly high speeds, making them extremely difficult to intercept.
So essentially they can evade traditional missile defense systems.
That's the idea, and they're also developing something called fractional orbital bombardment systems.
Fractional orbital bombardment, that sounds like something out of a science fiction movie.
It does a bit, but it's a real technology. The idea is to put a warhead into a low Earth orbit and then deorbit it, bringing it down on a target from an unexpected direction.
So it's harder to track and intercept because it's not following a predictable ballistic trajectory.
Precisely. And the report notes that China conducted a partial demonstration of this capability in a test back in 2021.
So it's not just theoretical, they're actually making progress on this.
And adding to this, the Pentagon assesses that China already possesses the leading arsenal of hypersonic missiles in the world.
So they're really ahead of the curve in terms of these advanced missile technologies.
That's the assessment from the Pentagon.
And the report also details some pretty significant developments in their construction of missile silos.
Yeah, they've been busy on that front.
So what have they been doing?
Well, they've added 3 new missile silo fields, which provide an additional 320 silos specifically for solid propellant ICBMs.
Okay, so that's a pretty big expansion of their silo-based ICBM force.
It is, and they're also more than doubling the size of their liquid propellant DF-5 ICBM force, likely bringing that to around 50 silos.
And those DF-5s are their older ICBMs, right?
They are, but they're still a significant part of their nuclear arsenal, and they're upgrading them.
Okay, and what about the new silos? What are those for?
Well, at least 30 of these new silos are intended for the DF-5C, which is a newer variant that's capable of carrying MIRV's multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles.
Okay, so one missile with multiple warheads that can hit different targets.
Exactly, and that significantly increases their strike capabilities.
The report also mentions their mobile DF-41 ICBMs, which are their most advanced road-mobile missiles.
Right. Those can carry up to 3 warheads each, and the report suggests that they might be deployed in both silos and on rail-based platforms.
So giving them more flexibility in how they deploy their nuclear forces.
Yes, making them less vulnerable to a first strike.
And it seems like their nuclear forces are also moving towards a state of higher readiness.
The report indicates that at least some elements of China's rocket force, which is their strategic missile command, are maintaining a portion of their nuclear forces on high alert status.
Okay, so that means they're essentially ready to launch on very short notice.
And the development of these new silo-based ICBMs, along with their investment in early warning systems, suggests a potential shift towards an early warning counterattack posture.
Which is essentially what the U.S. calls launch on warning, right?
Exactly, meaning they would launch their missiles if they detected an incoming attack.
So a much more hair-trigger approach.
It definitely raises the stakes in terms of potential escalation and the risk of miscalculation.
The report also mentioned that China conducted tests of ICBM launches from training silos in western China during 2023.
Yes, that's further evidence that they're moving in this direction of a more responsive nuclear posture.
So a pretty significant change from their previous approach.
It's a development that's being watched very closely by analysts and policymakers.
So we've talked about the land-based component of their nuclear forces. What about the other parts of their triad, their submarines and bombers?
Right, so China's sea-based nuclear deterrent is centered around their Type 094 Jin-class ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs as they're often called.
And they have 6 of those currently, right?
That's correct, all based at Yalong Naval Base on Hainan Island.
And those submarines are now conducting near-continuous deterrence patrols, according to the report.
Yes, meaning that at least one of those submarines is likely on patrol at any given time.
And they're equipped with the JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile, which has a pretty significant range.
It does. The JL-3 has the range to reach the continental U.S. from either the South China Sea or the Bohai Gulf.
So they can threaten the U.S. mainland without having to venture too far from their own shores.
And production of the Type 094 submarines continues, but they're also developing a new class of SSBN, the Type 096.
And that one is expected to be even more advanced.
Yes, it's expected to be quieter and equipped with a new MIRV-capable submarine-launched ballistic missile.
So even more firepower and harder to detect.
Precisely. And it's slated for production in the mid-2020s, although there might be some delays.
Okay, so that brings us to the third leg of their triad, their bomber aircraft.
Right. So currently they have the H-6N bomber, which can carry an air-launched ballistic missile.
And they're also developing that new stealth bomber, the H-20.
Yes, which is expected to have a very long range, potentially exceeding 10,000 kilometers.
So they're really working to improve their ability to deliver nuclear weapons from the air as well.
Absolutely. It's a comprehensive modernization effort across all 3 legs of the triad.
And the report also gets into how they're fueling this expansion, particularly the role of Russia.
Yes. The report highlights the fact that Russia has been supplying China with highly enriched uranium fuel for their fast breeder reactors.
Okay, and these reactors are ostensibly for civilian purposes, right?
That's what China claims. But the quantity of highly enriched uranium being supplied by Russia has raised concerns.
Because it could be diverted for weapons production.
Exactly, and it exceeds the total amount of such material removed worldwide under U.S. and IAEA auspices over the past 3 decades, so it's a significant amount.
So this raises questions about whether China's civilian nuclear program is truly as peaceful as they claim.
It's definitely a point of contention, and the report doesn't shy away from highlighting those concerns.
Okay, so it seems like this nuclear buildup is primarily driven by a desire to have credible options in a potential conflict over Taiwan.
That's the main driver. They want to deter the U.S. and its allies from intervening, and if deterrence fails, to be able to control escalation.
And their expanding nuclear forces give them more options in that scenario.
Right, they'd have the ability to target a greater number of U.S. cities, military installations, and leadership locations.
So the stakes are getting higher.
No doubt about it.
But the report goes beyond just nuclear weapons. It also details some pretty impressive advancements in their conventional military capabilities, especially their missile forces.
Absolutely. Their overarching counter-intervention strategy really relies on a wide array of missiles that can deliver both conventional and nuclear payloads with increasing accuracy.
So they're becoming a much more potent force, even without resorting to nuclear weapons.
And the report specifically mentions their joint firepower strike operations, which they've been simulating against Taiwan.
using their PCH-191 short-range ballistic missiles.
Right. Those are designed to overwhelm enemy defenses, and they've also been demonstrating their ability to rapidly deploy and surge their forces.
So it's not just about the hardware, it's about how they use it as well.
And their submarine force is becoming more capable, too. They have the Type 093B Shang 3 class of guided missile nuclear submarines.
And those can launch cruise missiles.
Potentially, yes. Some of them might be operational with land attack cruise missiles in the near future.
So they're adding another layer to their ability to project power.
And we shouldn't forget their anti-ship missile capabilities, which have been advancing rapidly.
Yeah, especially the DF-21D and DF-26, which have gotten a lot of attention.
Those are their carrier killer missiles designed to target U.S. aircraft carriers.
And they're also developing hypersonic anti-ship missiles like the YJ-21.
Right, which they've tested from their Type 055 Ren high-class cruisers.
Those are their big advanced warships.
With all the latest bells and whistles advanced sensors,
Yeah.
112 vertical launch tubes for all kinds of missiles.
So they're packing a lot of firepower.
They are, and it's clear that China's ambitions go beyond just regional dominance.
Right. The report talks about their goal of building a world-class military.
Yes, they want to be on par with or even superior to the U.S. by 2035 and 2049.
And that requires a global reach.
Precisely, they're seeking to expand their influence and project power around the world.
And their budget reflects that they have the second largest defense budget in the world.
Estimated to be between $330 and $450 billion annually.
So they're putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
And they're already the fourth largest global arms supplier.
So their influence is growing.
And they have the largest military in the world in terms of active personnel, over 2 million.
That's a massive force.
And their navy is growing rapidly, too, already. Over 370 ships and submarines, and projected to reach over 400 by 2030.
And they're modernizing their air force as well, with new transport aircraft and aerial refueling capabilities.
Yes, and they're actively seeking to establish bases and access points around the world to support their global ambitions.
So a very comprehensive and ambitious military buildup.
No doubt about it.
But the report doesn't sugarcoat things. It also talks about the problem of corruption within the Chinese military.
That's an important point. The Pentagon acknowledges that corruption can impact training standards and erode political loyalty.
So it's a factor that could undermine their effectiveness.
Right, and the report points to some recent high-profile removals of senior officers as evidence that this is an ongoing issue.
Like the removal of Admiral Miao Hua from the Central Military Commission.
Yes, and the ouster of several other high-ranking officers and defense industry executives in late 2023.
So it seems like Xi Jinping is trying to tackle this problem.
He is, but it's a deeply entrenched issue, and it's unclear how successful he'll be.
And the report makes it clear that despite this corruption, significant military progress is still being made.
Exactly. It's kind of a paradox. On the one hand, they have these internal challenges, but on the other hand, they're making undeniable progress in terms of their military capabilities.
It's a complex picture.
It is, and the Pentagon tries to address that directly in the report.
In what way?
Well, they point out that China tends to be very good at promoting its strengths while downplaying its weaknesses.
So we might not be getting the full picture.
Right, and they caution against confusing what they call China's dirty laundry with their very real designer clothes.
Meaning their advanced military hardware.
Exactly, they're producing some really impressive systems, and that can't be ignored.
And Xi Jinping is also continuing to push forward with significant military restructuring.
Yes, he's been shaking things up quite a bit.
Like disbanding the Strategic Support Force and creating these new service branches, the Aerospace Force,
Yeah.
the Cyberspace Force, and the Information Support Force.
Right, all directly under the Central Military Commission.
So it seems like he's really trying to modernize their command structure and adapt to the changing nature of warfare.
He is, and those reforms have the potential to be quite disruptive, but they also reflect the seriousness with which he's approaching military modernization.
So the overall assessment from the Pentagon seems to be that despite the internal challenges, China's military is on track to become a much more formidable force.
That's the takeaway. There's no doubt that they're making significant progress.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to our final source for this deep dive. The analysis of China's nuclear weapons from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. This gives us an independent expert perspective on this crucial aspect of their military development.
And it's worth noting that this analysis really reinforces many of the key findings from the Pentagon report.
So it's not just one side of the story.
Exactly, and they provide a lot of additional details and insights.
So what are some of the key takeaways from this analysis?
Well, they estimate that China currently has approximately 600 nuclear warheads, for their land-based missiles, sea-based missiles, and bombers.
Which aligns pretty closely with the Pentagon's assessment.
It does, and they also highlight that China is believed to have the fastest-growing nuclear arsenal among all 9 nuclear weapons states.
Wow, that's significant.
And they're the only nation that's a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty that's currently increasing the size of its nuclear stockpile.
So they're kind of an outlier in that sense.
They are, and the analysis also points out a key difference in how China manages its nuclear warheads compared to the U.S. and Russia.
What's the difference?
Well, unlike the U.S. and Russia, China is believed to store its warheads separately from their delivery systems.
So the warheads aren't mated to the missiles in peacetime.
Right, and that has implications for their readiness levels and their potential deployment postures.
Because it takes time to mate the warheads to the missiles.
Exactly, it's a more deliberate process.
And the analysis also gets into the future projections for China's nuclear arsenal.
Yes, they concur with the Pentagon's estimate of over 1,000 warheads by 2030.
Okay, so that seems to be the consensus.
But they also note that the Pentagon's earlier projection of 1,500 warheads by 2035 was not repeated in their latest report.
So there's some uncertainty about the longer-term trajectory.
And they point out that their own projections depend on a variety of factors.
Like how many silos they actually load with missiles, how many warheads per missile, and the overall pace of their deployments.
Exactly. There are a lot of variables at play.
And it's worth noting that their analysis relies heavily on open-source data and commercial satellite imagery.
Absolutely. That's become an essential tool for understanding military developments in less transparent countries like China.
Because they don't exactly publish detailed information about their nuclear forces.
Right, so you have to piece things together using whatever information is available.
And the bulletin team emphasizes their rigorous methodology in terms of cross-verifying information from multiple sources.
They use official statements, non-governmental reports, and commercial satellite imagery. And they're very careful about corroborating their findings.
And they acknowledge the inherent challenges in analyzing China's nuclear forces.
Because of the lack of official data and the controlled nature of their messaging.
So it's a bit of a detective game.
In some ways, yes.
But they also point to some potential signs of increased transparency.
Like the arms control consultations that were held with the U.S. in November 2023.
Okay, that's a positive development.
And the fact that China gave the U.S. advance notification before a test launch of a DF-31AG ICBM in September 2024.
So maybe they're trying to be a bit more open.
It's possible, but we'll have to see how that plays out.
And satellite imagery in particular has become incredibly valuable for understanding their missile bases and other infrastructure.
It's really revolutionized the field of military analysis. The resolution of commercial satellite imagery has gotten so good that you can see a lot of detail.
And the fact that the PLA tends to standardize their facility designs makes it easier to analyze.
Yes, you can start to recognize patterns and identify different types of facilities.
But the analysis also cautions against taking U.S. government estimates at face value.
Right. They point out that there can be institutional biases and that those estimates have been wrong in the past.
So it's important to have a healthy dose of skepticism.
Always a good approach with intelligence assessments.
And they express a relatively high degree of confidence in their own estimates of China's nuclear forces.
But they also acknowledge that there are still uncertainties.
Okay, so no one has a perfect picture.
That's the nature of this kind of analysis. You're dealing with incomplete information, and you have to make judgments based on the available evidence.
Now, the analysis also delves into China's production of fissile materials, which are the essential ingredients for nuclear weapons.
Right. They cite estimates of about 14 tons of highly enriched uranium and around 2.9 tons of separated plutonium as of 2023.
And that's enough for a lot of warheads.
It is. Those stockpiles have allowed them to double their estimated warhead count in the past 5 years and could potentially support reaching around 1,000 warheads by 2030.
But to go beyond that, they would need to produce more fissile material.
That's the assessment from both the Bulletin and the Pentagon.
And they're continuing to expand their production capabilities.
Right. They have new centrifuge enrichment plants that started operating in 2023, and they're increasing their tritium production as well.
And the analysis also raises concerns about the potential role of their civilian nuclear infrastructure in all of this.
Yes, there are worries that they could be using their civilian reactors and reprocessing plants to produce weapons-grade material.
And the Pentagon has stated publicly that they believe China is doing this.
Which China denies, of course.
But the fact that China has become less transparent about reporting its plutonium stockpiles to the IAEA adds to those concerns.
It does. It raises questions about their true intentions.
And the bulletin analysis reminds us that U.S. estimates have been inaccurate in the past.
So we should always be cautious about accepting any single estimate as gospel.
And they point out a current discrepancy between the observable size of China's nuclear forces and the estimated number of warheads.
Right, there are still some mysteries to be solved.
It's interesting that while China hasn't denied the expansion of their ICBM force or the new silo construction, they have pushed back against what they call sensationalist claims.
That's a typical tactic, trying to control the narrative and downplay the significance of their actions.
But it's clear that they're sensitive to how these developments are being perceived.
And the bulletin analysis also gets into the ongoing debate about China's nuclear intentions.
Because there are different interpretations of what they're ultimately trying to achieve.
Right. Some U.S. officials believe that China is moving away from minimum deterrence and seeking parity with the U.S.
Meaning they want to have a nuclear arsenal that's comparable in size and capability.
But the bulletin analysts believe that's probably an overstatement.
Because even their projected numbers are still far below the current U.S. stockpile.
Exactly. So it's more nuanced than that.
And the analysis also discusses the issue of nuclear weapons testing.
Yes, specifically the activities at China's Lopner test site, which have raised some concerns.
Because there have been suggestions that they might be conducting low-yield tests.
Right, which would be a violation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
But China hasn't ratified that treaty.
True, but they have maintained a moratorium on nuclear testing since the 1990s.
And they haven't been explicitly accused of conducting a full-scale test.
But the activities at Lopner have been ambiguous enough to raise concerns.
Okay, so it's something that's being watched closely.
Definitely.
And finally, the analysis looks at China's declared nuclear doctrine and policy, specifically their no first use pledge.
Right, which they've reiterated many times.
So they claim they would never be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict.
And they also say they won't use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states.
Okay, but there's some ambiguity about the specific circumstances under which they might consider using them.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.